It was a Thursday evening, unremarkable in every way, until I found the envelope. Sitting among the stack of mundane bills and glossy flyers, its elegant design stood out. A cream card with gold edges, weighty and deliberate. The words, "You are cordially invited," were printed in a delicate script, and the address at the bottom was unfamiliar. I stood in the entryway for a moment, the house quiet except for the faint hum of the dishwasher. Emily was in the kitchen, her movements purposeful as she diced vegetables for dinner. I called out to her, holding up the card. "Hey, Eminencia, did you see this?" She glanced over her shoulder, wiping her hands on a dish towel. Her smile was quick and practiced, but it didn't reach her eyes. "What is it?" "An invitation. Looks fancy. Do you know anything about it?" She crossed the room, taking the card from me. For the briefest second, her fingers hesitated on the edge, and her expression shifted, subtle, almost imperceptible, but I caught it. Then, just as quickly, she smiled again, handing it back to me. "Probably junk mail," she said lightly. "You know how they target people in our neighborhood." Her answer seemed plausible enough. We've been getting mailers for years inviting us to wine tastings, charity galas, and all manner of overpriced events meant to stroke egos and empty wallets. But this felt different. As she turned back to the stove, I studied her, trying to shake off the feeling that something was amiss. Emily wasn't prone to lying. She'd always been an open book, and we prided ourselves on honesty. But that flicker of hesitation stayed with me long after she handed the invitation back. That night, as she slept beside me, the invitation lingered on my mind. I'd left it on the kitchen counter, but its weight felt heavier than paper. I told myself it was nothing, that I was overthinking. Yet, an ache had settled in my chest, the kind that warned of something unseen but looming. The following days passed in a haze of routine, but the invitation never left my mind. Emily didn't bring it up again, and I found myself unwilling to broach the subject. It wasn't until Saturday morning that my unease returned in full force. "Heading to yoga," Emily announced, breezing past me in her workout gear, her ponytail swaying as she grabbed her water bottle. Yoga wasn't new for her, but the frequency was. What had started as a twice-weekly routine had become nearly daily, and her sessions were longer than ever. I smiled at her as she kissed my cheek and slipped out the door, but the unease churned inside me like a storm brewing beneath calm waters. Something felt off. I don't know what possessed me to do it, but I decided to follow her. I gave her a few minutes, then grabbed my keys and slipped into my car. Guilt gnawed at me as I tailed her down familiar streets, maintaining a cautious distance. I wasn't sure what I expected to find: a yoga studio, maybe, or perhaps confirmation that I was overreacting. But when she turned onto a secluded road leading out of town, my stomach tightened. The address from the invitation flashed in my mind. She didn't drive to a yoga studio. Instead, she pulled up to a sprawling estate tucked behind iron gates. My heart pounded as I parked at a distance, watching her step out of the car, her demeanor relaxed, even confident. She wasn't alone. A man approached her, tall, well-dressed, and unfamiliar. He greeted her with a warmth that made my chest ache, his hand lightly brushing her lower back as they walked toward the estate. I wanted to look away, to convince myself I was wrong. But I couldn't. My wife, my Emily, was here with him, walking into a world I wasn't part of. I stayed in my car for what felt like an eternity, torn between confrontation and retreat. The invitation had been meant for her, not us, and she hadn't told me. What was this place? Who was he? Questions clawed at my mind, each one heavier than the last. I wanted answers, but I was terrified of what they might reveal. When I finally started the car and drove away, my chest was hollow, the weight of what I'd seen pressing down like a stone. Emily came home hours later, her smile as bright as ever. "Yoga was great," she said casually, leaning in to kiss me. I nodded, my throat tight, unable to respond. I didn't tell her I knew. Not yet. Instead, I held on to the silence, letting it stretch between us like a shadow. The truth was a monster lurking in the corner of our lives, waiting to devour everything we'd built. And I wasn't ready to face it. Not yet. The invitation sat on the nightstand next to my phone, as though mocking me in the dim light of the bedroom. It looked so innocent, just paper and ink, but it had shattered something fragile inside me. The house was quiet except for the occasional creak of the old floors and the low hum of the refrigerator. Emily was asleep, her breathing soft and steady. I lay on my back, staring at the ceiling, the weight of the evening pressing down on me like a vice. The man's face was etched into my mind, his easy confidence, the way he looked at her, as if she belonged to him. I closed my eyes, replaying the image of Emily's smile. It wasn't forced or polite, it was real. That thought made my chest feel like it was caving in. I wanted to believe there was a logical explanation for all of it, but deep down, I knew the truth was rarely logical. She was lying to me. The next morning, I woke before Emily. I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. The invitation was still there, face down like a guilty secret. I felt like I was teetering on the edge of something dangerous. Half of me screaming to confront her, the other half terrified of what I might hear. Emily walked into the kitchen, barefoot, her hair a tousled mess. She smiled when she saw me. "Good morning," she murmured, leaning down to kiss my cheek. I didn't move. My heart was pounding so loudly, I was sure she could hear it. "Morning," I replied, my voice thick with tension. She poured herself a cup of coffee and sat across from me, oblivious to the storm brewing in my head. She looked normal, happy even. How could she be so calm while I was unraveling? The rest of the day passed in fragments. I went through the motions, errands, emails, chores, but my mind stayed locked on that estate. I tried to rationalize her behavior. Maybe it was a work-related event she didn't want to explain. Maybe the man was a business contact. But if that were true, why hadn't she mentioned it? Why lie? By the time night fell, I was suffocating beneath the weight of unspoken words. I couldn't bear the silence anymore. "Emily," I said as she brushed her hair in front of the mirror. "Can I ask you something?" She turned, her eyes curious. "Of course." I hesitated, my pulse racing. "Are you happy? I mean, with us?" Her brow furrowed. "Where's this coming from?" "I don't know," I muttered. "I've just felt distant lately, like you've been somewhere else." Emily's expression softened. She crossed the room and sat next to me, taking my hand. "Greg, I'm fine. We're fine. I've just been stressed with work. You don't need to worry so much." She sounded sincere, but her words felt rehearsed, like she'd been preparing for this conversation. I studied her face, searching for cracks in the facade. But Emily was good at this, too good. If I didn't already know what I'd seen, I might have believed her. That night, after she'd fallen asleep, I made a decision. If she wasn't going to tell me the truth, I'd find it myself. The estate wasn't some figment of my imagination. It was real. The invitation had an address, and it was time to see what lay beyond those gates. The following weekend, Emily left for yoga again, her routine as predictable as clockwork. I waited until she was gone, then grabbed my coat and keys. I knew what I was about to do was reckless, maybe even desperate, but I didn't care. When I pulled up to the estate's gates, my stomach twisted with nerves. The towering iron fence loomed above me. But this time, I wasn't content to watch from a distance. I parked and walked toward the entrance. The gates were open, a subtle sign that something exclusive was underway. Inside, the long driveway was lined with sleek cars, their polished surfaces reflecting the soft glow of the lanterns hanging from the trees. The estate itself was breathtaking, a sprawling mansion with wide marble steps and arched windows that gleamed beneath the setting sun. The sound of soft laughter and faint music drifted from inside. My hands felt clammy as I climbed the stairs. I had no plan, no strategy. I was walking into a world I didn't belong to, driven only by the need to understand. The moment I stepped inside, I was overwhelmed. The air smelled of expensive perfume and freshly polished wood. Couples in designer clothes sipped champagne, their conversations a low hum beneath the string quartet playing in the corner. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over the room, making everything feel surreal, like stepping into a dream or maybe a nightmare. Then I saw her, Emily. She stood near the grand piano, wearing a black satin dress that clung to her frame. She looked stunning, effortlessly elegant. But it wasn't her appearance that shattered me. It was the way she laughed, tilting her head as if nothing in the world could touch her. She looked freer than I'd seen her in years. And standing next to her, with his hand on the small of her back, was the same man from before. I felt like the ground had shifted beneath me. My feet were rooted in place as waves of disbelief and fury washed over me. I had come here for answers, But instead, I was watching my life unravel in front of me. Her betrayal wasn't whispered. It was paraded. She hadn't just lied to me. She'd built an entire world where I didn't exist. I couldn't breathe. The room around me spun as though the world itself had tilted off its axis. My wife, my Emily, stood there radiant, laughing in a way I hadn't seen in years. And he was there beside her, comfortable in her space, like he belonged. I should have turned around and walked out. I should have spared myself the sight. But I couldn't. Instead, I forced my legs to move, weaving through the crowd until I was close enough to hear her voice. "It feels like I can finally be myself," Emily said softly, her hand grazing his arm as she spoke. Her words pierced me like a dagger. Herself? Who was she when she was with me? A lie? A facade? The man leaned in, murmuring something I couldn't catch. Whatever he said made her laugh again, a warm, genuine sound that cracked something inside me. I stood there, invisible, my heart hammering in my chest. I wanted to charge forward, grab him by the collar, demand answers, but I knew it wouldn't end the way I wanted. This wasn't a bar fight where I could reclaim my pride with a few punches. This was a betrayal too complex for fists and fury. A waiter passed by, holding a tray of champagne flutes. I grabbed one, the cold glass pressing into my palm like an anchor. I needed something to steady me before I crumbled completely. I watched as they made their way toward the grand ballroom, Emily's hand resting lightly on his arm. The crowd parted for them like they were royalty. I followed at a distance, careful to stay out of sight, but close enough to observe. The ballroom was breathtaking. Golden chandeliers dripped with crystals, and the polished floor gleamed beneath the dim lights. Couples danced slowly to a hauntingly beautiful melody, their movements fluid and graceful. Then I saw them again, Emily and the man. He held her close as they swayed to the music, their bodies moving in sync. My pulse roared in my ears. That was our song, the one we danced to at our wedding. I set the champagne glass down with a trembling hand and forced myself to breathe. I had two choices: walk away and pretend this nightmare wasn't happening, or confront her here and now, in front of everyone. But something told me this wasn't the place. I turned on my heel and headed toward the exit, the soft hum of music and laughter chasing me down the marble hallway. Each step felt heavier than the last. I didn't know what hurt more, her betrayal or the realization that she looked happier in that stranger's arms than she ever had in mine. I stumbled out into the night air, gasping for breath like I'd been suffocating inside. The cool breeze stung my face, but I welcomed it. The estate loomed behind me, its grandeur now a hollow shell in my eyes. I leaned against my car, staring up at the stars that blinked indifferently above. I felt hollow, like someone had reached inside and pulled out everything that made me whole. It wasn't until I was halfway home that the shock began to fade, replaced by something darker, anger. Not the kind of anger that burned hot and then fizzled out. This was slow and simmering, like embers that threatened to ignite everything around them. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, the leather creaking beneath my hands. She had lied to me, built a life behind my back, and danced in the arms of another man as though I was nothing more than a distant memory. When I pulled into the driveway, the house looked different, colder. The windows were dark, and the porch light flickered like it too, was unsure whether to stay on or give up. I stepped inside, the familiar scent of our home doing little to comfort me. The silence pressed in like a heavy blanket, suffocating. I stood there, staring at the photos lining the hallway, pictures of us on vacations, birthdays, anniversaries, smiling faces that now felt like ghosts. How long had this been going on? How many moments had I replayed in my head, believing they were signs of love, only to realize they were distractions from the truth? I found myself standing in our bedroom doorway, staring at the bed where we'd shared so many nights. It felt tainted now, stained by the knowledge of her lies. My gaze drifted to her side of the room, her favorite books stacked on the nightstand, the soft throw blanket she always wrapped herself in during movie nights. How could she betray everything we'd built? And more importantly, why hadn't she told me? If she was so unhappy, why hadn't she had the decency to say it aloud? I wanted answers, but I wasn't sure I could handle them. Hours passed as I sat in the darkness, listening to the ticking of the clock. When I finally heard her car in the driveway, my heart lurched in my chest. I felt like a prisoner waiting for sentencing. The front door opened, and her footsteps padded lightly down the hall. She paused at the bedroom door, her silhouette framed by the soft glow of the hallway light. "Greg," she whispered, "you're still awake?" I stared at her, my expression unreadable. "Yeah," I replied, my voice hoarse. She walked in, slipping out of her heels and tossing her purse onto the chair. "The yoga class ran long," she said casually, stretching her arms over her head. I almost laughed. Yoga class? How effortlessly the lie slid off her tongue. "I didn't know yoga classes had waltzing now," I said, my voice low but sharp. Her head snapped toward me, her eyes wide with confusion and fear. "What?" I stood slowly, stepping toward her. "I saw you, Emily," I whispered. "I followed you. I saw everything." Her breath hitched, and in that moment I saw the mask slip. The composed, unbothered woman I'd been staring at for days shattered like glass. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. I watched her struggle, her lips trembling as the reality of the moment crashed down on her. "I trusted you," I said, my voice breaking, "and you threw it all away." Tears welled in her eyes, but I couldn't feel sympathy. "Not now. Not after everything." She reached for me, but I stepped back, my hands clenched in a fist at my sides. "Don't," I warned. "Don't lie to me anymore." And with that, the world we'd built began to crumble. Emily's hand hovered in the space between us, trembling slightly before she let it fall. Her face was pale, the color drained from her cheeks, as if I'd reached inside and pulled the truth from her veins. I could see her searching for the right words, but there were none that could undo what I had seen. "Greg," she whispered, her voice breaking. Don't," I interrupted, the bitterness cutting through the air like a whip. "Don't say you can explain. Don't insult me like that." Tears brimmed in her eyes. "I wasn't trying to hurt you." I let out a sharp, humorless laugh. "You weren't trying to hurt me? You built an entire life behind my back. I swallowed hard, my throat burning. You danced with him. You smiled at him the way you used to smile at me. You let him touch you. How do you say that's not supposed to hurt?" She flinched at my words, but didn't deny them. She didn't try to lie anymore. She couldn't. "I didn't mean for this to happen," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It just happened." "That's not good enough," I said coldly. "Things like this don't just happen." I took a step closer, anger surging through me like a tidal wave. "Who is he? How long?" Emily wiped at her eyes, but it was useless. Tears kept falling, staining her cheeks. 6 months, she confessed. "His name is Adrian." The name stung, like poison seeping into an open wound. Adrian. He had a name now, a name that would haunt me for the rest of my life. 6 months, I repeated, my voice hollow. 6 months, and you didn't once think to tell me you weren't happy? You didn't think I deserved the truth before you decided to throw us away? She shook her head desperately. "It wasn't like that. I never wanted to end things with you. I was confused, Greg. I felt trapped." Trapped? I could barely get the word out. It felt like a slap. Trapped by what? Our marriage? Our life together? Emily closed her eyes for a moment, as though she was trying to gather the pieces of herself before they crumbled completely. "By myself," she admitted. "By this version of me that felt like a stranger. I've been pretending for so long that I didn't even know who I was anymore. I felt like the room was tilting beneath me." She wasn't just confessing to an affair. She was confessing to a kind of grief I hadn't known existed. "I thought we were happy," I whispered, my voice raw. "I thought we were okay." "We were," she said quickly, stepping closer. "We were happy, Greg. I swear we were. But then something inside me broke, and I didn't know how to fix it. Adrian, he wasn't supposed to be anything more than a distraction." The mention of his name again sent a jolt of rage through me. "A distraction?" I spat. "Is that all he was? Because it didn't look like a distraction when you were dancing with him. It looked like love." Emily's face crumpled. No, it's not love. It's nothing compared to what I feel for you." I stared at her, searching her face for a shred of sincerity. There was the woman I loved, the woman who had once been my whole world, standing in front of me, begging for forgiveness. But the betrayal was too big, too jagged to swallow. "You should have told me you were unhappy," I said quietly. "Instead, you ran to someone else and pretended everything was fine. You lied to my face every day." Emily. Her knees seemed to give out, and she sank onto the edge of the bed, burying her face in her hands. Her shoulders shook with sobs, and for a fleeting second, I felt the urge to comfort her. But the anger was stronger. "I don't know if I can ever forgive you," I said, each word like glass in my throat. Emily's head snapped up, her eyes wide and desperate. "Please, Greg, don't say that. Don't give up on us." I leaned against the door frame, exhausted by the weight of everything. "You already gave up, Emily. You just didn't tell me." Her sobs grew louder, and I turned away, unable to look at her anymore. I walked down the hall to the living room and sat on the couch, staring blankly at the darkened TV screen. The silence that followed was deafening. I didn't know how long I sat there, minutes, maybe hours, lost in the wreckage of our life. Eventually, Emily came into the room, her steps hesitant. She looked fragile, her face blotchy from crying. "What now?" she asked, her voice trembling. I exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand over my face. "I don't know," I said honestly. "I just don't know." I could see the fear in her eyes, the realization that I wasn't sure if we could survive this. She opened her mouth to speak, but thought better of it. Instead, she nodded slowly, then retreated to the bedroom, leaving me alone in the dim light of the living room. That night, I slept on the couch, or rather, I tried to. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw them dancing under the chandeliers, their silhouettes swaying in perfect harmony. I saw his hand on her back, the way her head tilted toward his like she belonged there. I felt hollow, like everything that had made me who I was had been hollowed out, leaving an empty shell behind. Somewhere, deep in the pit of my stomach, a question clawed its way to the surface. If I stay, will I ever trust her again? And for the first time in my life, I didn't know if love was enough to fix what was broken. Morning came slowly, the first slivers of dawn creeping through the blinds like an uninvited guest. I hadn't slept. Not really. I stared at the ceiling for hours, drowning in memories that felt like they belonged to someone else's life. The laughter, the quiet Sunday mornings, the whispered promises at night, they all felt tainted now. I could hear Emily stirring in the bedroom, the soft creak of the bed as she sat up. My heart twisted painfully. There was a time when hearing her wake up meant comfort, familiarity. Now, it felt like the prelude to another confrontation I wasn't ready to have. I forced myself up and made coffee, the bitter smell filling the kitchen. My movements felt robotic. Pour the water, stir, wait. When the mug was in my hands, I barely noticed the warmth. Emily appeared in the doorway, wrapped in her favorite gray cardigan. Her hair was a mess, her eyes red and swollen. She looked as broken as I felt. "Hi," she said, her voice tentative, almost scared. We stood there, the weight of everything unsaid pressing down like a physical force. "Did you sleep?" she asked softly. I shook my head. "Did you?" She offered a weak smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Not really." The silence between us grew unbearable. Finally, Emily took a small step forward. "Greg, please. We need to talk." "I know." I exhaled slowly, steeling myself for what was coming. "But not like this. Not standing in the kitchen, pretending we're fine." Her eyes flickered with something, hope, maybe. "Can we go sit?" I nodded, and we moved to the living room, the same way you might approach a funeral service, slowly, with dread. We sat on opposite sides of the couch, as though the space between us was some unbreachable chasm. She wrapped her arms around herself, like she was trying to hold her body together. "I know you hate me," she began, her voice cracking. "I don't hate you," I said, surprising myself. The anger was still there, sharp and jagged, but hate felt too simple for what I was feeling. "I'm just hurt, and I don't understand why." Emily nodded, swallowing hard. "I don't know how to explain it, but I'll try." I braced myself, clutching the edge of the cushion as if the words would knock me over. "It wasn't about you," she said, her eyes glistening with fresh tears. "You've always been everything I needed, Greg. But somewhere along the way, I stopped being enough for myself." Her words landed heavily, confusing and cruel in their honesty. She continued, her voice thick with emotion. "I felt invisible, not because of you, but because of me. I looked in the mirror and didn't recognize who I was anymore. And then Adrian, he made me feel seen." I clenched my jaw, the name alone making my blood boil. "You could have told me," I said bitterly. "I'm your husband. You could have said something instead of letting a stranger step in. I was scared, she admitted. Scared you'd think I was weak. Scared you'd see me the way I saw myself, broken. The room felt like it was closing in. My mind raced through all the times I'd asked her if she was okay, the times I'd kissed her forehead and told her how strong she was. I'd thought my love was enough to shield her from whatever storm she was facing, but I'd been wrong. So, what was I? I asked, my voice low. A placeholder? Someone who made life easier until you found something more exciting. Her head snapped up, and I could see the horror in her expression. No, you're everything to me. Adrian wasn't real, Greg. He wasn't part of my life. He was part of a fantasy I built because I was afraid of losing myself. I wanted to believe her. God, I wanted to. But the betrayal had carved a deep wound that no words could heal. So, what now? I asked, exhaustion dripping from my words. What do you want from me, Emily? Tears streamed down her face. I want you to stay. I want us to fix this. I'll do anything, Greg. Therapy, counseling, whatever you need. But please, don't walk away from us. I leaned back, staring at the ceiling as tears threatened to spill from my own eyes. I'd dreamed of hearing those words so many times, an admission, a promise. But now that I had them, they felt hollow. The truth was, I didn't know if I had the strength to stay. I didn't know if I could look at her every day and not see the man who'd taken my place, even if it was only for moments. Emily, I began, my voice cracking. Do you even know how much this has broken me? She reached out hesitantly, her fingers brushing mine. I know. I'll spend the rest of my life making it up to you, if that's what it takes. I stared at her hand, warm against mine, and for the first time in days, I felt something other than rage. I felt grief, the raw, overwhelming kind that comes from losing something you thought was unshakable. I closed my eyes and let out a shaky breath. I need time, I whispered. I need to figure out if I can forgive this, if I can forgive us. Her breath hitched, but she nodded slowly. Take all the time you need, she whispered back. Just don't give up on me yet. I didn't answer. I didn't know if I could. That night, I packed a bag. Emily watched me from the bedroom doorway, silent but pleading with her eyes. I wasn't leaving for good. Not yet, but I needed space. I needed to breathe without the walls of our home pressing in on me, without seeing the ghosts of our past in every corner. As I stepped outside, the cold night air bit at my skin, but it was nothing compared to the chill in my heart. I didn't know where I was going or how long I'd be gone. All I knew was that somewhere along the way, I had to figure out if I could ever trust her again, or if our love had already burned to ash. The motel room was small and unremarkable, a worn bedspread, a humming mini-fridge, and a window overlooking a cracked parking lot. But it gave me something I hadn't had at home: space. I stared at my packed duffel bag in the corner, the fabric still stiff from lack of use. I thought that getting out of the house would make things clearer, that stepping away would help me see the bigger picture. But now that I was alone, all I felt was emptiness. The minutes bled into hours as I sat on the edge of the bed, replaying our last conversation over and over again. Her words haunted me. I'll spend the rest of my life making it up to you. The sincerity in her voice had shaken me to my core. But could love survive this kind of devastation? Could it be rebuilt from the rubble? I found myself driving aimlessly later that night, the hum of the tires on the road a kind of lullaby for my spiraling thoughts. The streets were quiet, the city asleep. The places we'd shared memories, our favorite diner, the park where we picnicked in the summers, blurred as I passed them. They all felt different now, like relics from a past life. My phone buzzed in the passenger seat. I didn't need to look to know who it was. Emily had called and texted me several times since I left, each message more desperate than the last. I hadn't answered any of them, not because I wanted to hurt her, but because I didn't know what to say. I pulled into the empty parking lot of the overlook where we used to watch the sunset. The city stretched below, a sea of twinkling lights, but I barely noticed. I closed my eyes and rested my forehead against the steering wheel, breathing in the cold, metallic scent of the night air. We were supposed to be forever. I thought back to our wedding day. Emily in her white dress, looking at me like I was the only man in the world. I remember the way we'd slow danced under the stars that night, her head resting on my shoulder as I whispered promises I thought I'd never break. But forever was only as strong as the choices we made. And somewhere along the way, hers had shattered us. My heart twisted painfully as I thought of her alone in the house, sitting in the dark, probably blaming herself for everything. She should. She had made terrible choices. But I wasn't innocent either, was I? I'd missed the signs, convinced myself that if I loved her enough, it would be enough to fix anything. It wasn't. The sky began to lighten as dawn broke, a soft glow rising over the horizon. The first morning after everything came crashing down. I hadn't slept at all. My body was exhausted, but my mind was caught in a loop, asking the same question over and over. Can you live without her? The truth settled in my chest like a slow, steady ache. No, I couldn't. But I also couldn't live with her unless something changed. I turned the key in the ignition and drove back. The road blurred, and the house loomed ahead before I even realized I'd arrived. The porch light was still on, flickering faintly, a beacon calling me home. Emily was sitting at the kitchen table when I walked in, her head resting on her folded arms. She sat up as soon as she heard the door, her eyes wide with disbelief and hope. Greg, her voice cracked with emotion. She stood but didn't rush to me. She was too afraid I'd disappear again. You came back. I set my keys on the counter and let out a slow breath. I don't know if we can fix this, I said honestly, my voice low. Tears welled up in her eyes again, but she nodded, understanding. But you're here, she whispered. I'm here, I repeated, feeling the weight of those words. She took a tentative step forward. I know I've destroyed everything, she said, her voice raw. But I want to be better. I want to be someone who deserves you. Even if it takes years. I'll do the work. I ran a hand over my face, trying to steady myself. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that love could survive the kind of cracks she had made. But I wasn't naive anymore. I need time, Emily, I said quietly. I can't forgive you overnight. This isn't something we can sweep under the rug. She nodded again, wiping at her face with shaking hands. I'll wait. However long it takes, I'll wait. We stood there, the weight of the moment pressing down on both of us. For the first time in weeks, I saw her as she was, no pretense, no mask. Just Emily. And I saw myself, too, bruised, battered, but somehow still standing. I reached out, brushing a lock of hair behind her ear. It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. But it was something. A small step toward healing, however uncertain. Emily's eyes closed at the touch, a soft sob escaping her lips. I'm so sorry, she whispered again. I know, I said. And I did. I knew. I didn't have all the answers. I didn't know if we'd survive this. But in that moment, I knew one thing. I wasn't ready to say goodbye. Not yet. We sat together in the quiet of the kitchen as the morning light filled the room, casting away the shadows. And though the path ahead was uncertain, one thing was clear. We would face it together. Whether we broke or healed would depend on what came next. But at least for now, we had chosen to try. And sometimes, trying is the bravest thing you can do.